Variable fonts are a game changer for web typography. A variable font is a font file that is able to store a continuous range of design variants, and we can animate those variants with CSS. The key to animating variable fonts is the font variation settings property. We can animate any axis of variation defined in the font itself with the font variation settings property. The variants available to animate will vary from font to font, and a site like whatcanmyfontdo.com can help show you the options that are available for any given variable font. For example, if I drop a copy of the recursive variable font on the site, it will give me this report of all the characteristics and variable axes available in this particular font. I can even test them out right here to see what they look like. Many fonts will show their variable properties on their websites as well, like Recursive does here. Looking at the demo section of the page, we can see that Recursive has 5 axes of variation: mono, casual, weight, slant, and cursive. Each axis has its own 4-letter name, and each of these can take a range of values, as shown in the demo. As those values change, the appearance of the font changes, and the font variation settings property lets us animate those value changes. Let's go look at some of this in action in our own CSS. I'm using the same font we just looked at, Recursive, here in my example. Let's animate some of the variable aspects of Recursive with a keyframe animation. So I'll write my keyframe block, and I'll name this animation vars since we're animating a variable font. I'll start with my 0% keyframe, and this is where I can start to use the font variation settings property. We know from its site that Recursive has axes for casual, cursive, weight, and slant. I'll use these in the font variation settings to create my animation. So we'll start with the font variation settings property. And first, I'll use the name of the casual axis, which is CASL, and start with a value of 1. Then onto the cursive axis, which is CRSV. Give that a value of 1 as well. And for weight, which is WGHT, we'll go with 300. And slant, which is SLNT, we'll give that a value of 0. I'm going to go on and add a couple more keyframes for 25% and 75%, with different settings in the font variation settings, just for a little variation in our animation. At 25, I'll set the casual axis to 0, cursive also to 0, weight to 600 to get a little bit heftier in the weight, and the slant to -10. At 75%, I'll set the casual back to 0, the cursive remaining at 0, the weight at 300, and our slant at -10. And since I'm going to have this animation repeating infinitely, I will make our 100% keyframe equal to our 0% keyframe, so that way it'll start and end in exactly the same place. Last but not least, I'll assign this animation to our H1. So we'll give it the animation of vars, and I'll have it take 8 seconds, make it a little bit long, have it repeat infinitely, and I'm going to use the easing of linear just so we can really get a sense of how the variable font itself is changing and animating as it goes. So we can save this and preview it in our browser. Refresh. And you can see we have our H1 that has the word hello in it, animating through the variations of the axes we adjusted through our keyframe animation. There's so much potential in what we can do with animating variable fonts, and they allow us to create animation effects that wouldn't be possible without them. But I should note that at the time of recording, variable fonts are still fairly new, so there are a couple of things to keep in mind if you're using them for animation. First is that not all variable fonts are created equal. Some may have very interesting axes for you to animate for creative effects, while others may have a very limited range. It might take a bit of time to find the ones that have the range you like. The second is that animating variable fonts is currently not very performant, so it's best to use it sparingly in production. This might change as variable fonts see more use, but keep an eye on your animation performance if you're using variable font animations in your projects. Variable fonts are very interesting to experiment with for many reasons, so I highly recommend checking them out and taking a look at the power they bring to the web.